Today's video will be about the Civil War, and you are in 5th grade social studies. So for our first topic of the day, let's go ahead and take a peek at some of the different causes of the war. Now, the war was caused basically because of the many differences in the beliefs between the North and the South. So we're talking about the northern states and the southern states. So if you take a peek at this chart right here, you can see that one of the main differences along this left-hand column were the economic differences between the two, the differences in how they made money and how they maintained their money. So in the North, they had factories, and it was a very industrialized part of our country. They relied on those factories and those plants for making their income. On the other hand, in the South, they had large plantations. They were an agricultural based economy where they relied on their farms and what their farms could produce, such as cotton and tobacco. In the North, money was not plentiful yet, but it was still developing. So some of these industries were starting to take off and were beginning to make some decent money. In the South, they had a reputation for already being very prosperous or very wealthy from farming tobacco and those cotton plants that we just mentioned. They also had many cultural differences between the two. The North generally believed in freedom for African American slaves, while on the other hand, the southern states, they depended on slavery for their way of life. They depended on that slave labor to produce the tobacco and cotton for making their economy go. Another difference was that the North was largely an urban society. In other words, people lived mainly in towns and held jobs in towns. And in the South, it was more rural, it was more agricultural. They lived in small villages and on those large farms called plantations. And they also had major disagreements about how the government should be run. The North believed in a strong national government and they wanted the nation to stay together, versus the South decided that the states' rights were the most important, and they felt that they had the right to secede if their rights were not being followed, or if their rights were not being observed. Continuing with some other causes of the war, we're talking about the Missouri Compromise. Now, what happened is there was a lot of fear about having too many northern states, and you can see from this map the states in blue, that there would be too many northern states, that they would outnumber the number of southern states that observed slavery in our Congress in Washington, D.C. So there was this idea that each state that was south of this little green line I'm indicating, and that's in the southern part of the state of Missouri, that any state that was added south of that line would be slave states. And any line or any state that was added north of that line would be a free state or have no slavery in that state. And that worked all well and good until the Compromise of 1850. And that happened when the state of California entered the Union. Now, California messed things up because it was both north and south of that Missouri Compromise line. So now, new states from this compromise, new states could choose for themselves whether they wanted to be a free state, like some of these blue ones indicated on the map, or if they wanted to be slave states and observe the practice of slavery. Now, this was seen as a victory for the northern states that people were able to choose. So, to compromise, what they had to do is they had to agree to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And what that law did is it said that if any northern citizen, so if you're up in one of these free states and you find a runaway slave, it is your responsibility, according to the law, to return that slave to their master, to their owner. Continuing with more causes of the war, there were a few other events that I'm not going to go into great detail on that raised tensions between the states, such as the Dred Scott decision and John Brown's raid, where, just to briefly mention John Brown's raid, what happened is he was a white northerner, and he decided it would be a good idea to raid a federal arsenal where they are holding federal weapons. And he was going to take the weapons out of that federal arsenal, and he thought it would be a good idea to give them to slaves to start an uprising, to start a revolt. Well, the revolt didn't take off like he hoped it would. He was caught and he was executed actually for his crimes. Now, a lot of people viewed him as this brave hero, but probably more people viewed him as more of a crazy man for his choices that he made. Now, he also led to fears about what would happen if African American slaves would revolt or start a war against their southern slave owners. Now, the final straw was when this guy right here was elected, Abraham Lincoln. Up to this point, before he was elected, he was very well known as someone who opposed slavery. So when he was elected president as a Republican candidate, the southern states said, that's it. We know things are just going to go downhill from here. So that's when they decided to make a major change. And that major change is they were going to start their own country. The state of South Carolina, right here indicated by the cursor, that was the first state to secede from the Union. In other words, they were the first state to leave the United States. Many states soon followed, including Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas shortly after followed. They decided to form a new country, and they called themselves the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. And Jefferson Davis, who previously was a senator from the state of Mississippi, he was elected as the first president of these Confederate states. Now, not long after the Confederate States formed, the first battle in the Civil War started, and that happened in South Carolina. To set the stage, President Lincoln, he ordered that his Union troops, or his Northern troops, would take control of all forts in the United States, because there was all this talk of them starting their own country. Now, since the Confederates said, hey, we're our own country, they viewed it as an invasion of their land, as them invading their territory. So in retaliation, after the Union troops occupied Fort Sumter, the Confederate Army, or the Southern Army, attacked on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Union troops eventually surrendered the following day. And even though no one was killed in this fighting, it sparked outrage and change in our country. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, 4 more states left the Union. So the Confederacy was now up to 11 states. The new ones that joined them were Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Those were the 4 new ones that left after the Battle of Fort Sumter. Let's talk a little bit about the actual Confederate Army. So another word for Confederate Army, I could call them the Southern Army, and they were sometimes nicknamed rebels. The Confederates, they thought that they had the advantage in the war, and their logic came from the training that their army had. They believed they had a better trained army, and by many accounts they did, and that boys in the South would grow up hunting. They grew up riding horses and hunting. We talked in a previous slide that they grew up in more of an agricultural system, a rural area. So they grew up riding horses and hunting, things that lend themselves very well to being a soldier back in that day and age. They also felt like they were fighting for a cause. Confederates believed they were fighting to maintain their way of life, and they believed they had far better leadership. The Southern generals were brilliant and well trained, many of them attending West Point, which was the premier area to receive an education and a military education. And in fact, the head of the Confederate Army, his name was Robert E. Lee. Now, this guy was actually President Lincoln's first choice to be the commander of the Union Army, or the Northern Army. So he was a very well-respected general. However, he had to turn Lincoln down because he felt he had more loyalty to his home state of Virginia, who ended up seceding from the United States, than the allegiance he felt he had to his country. So he turned down Lincoln, even though he was against slavery. He turned Lincoln down because he had more loyalty to his state of Virginia than to his country of the United States. And you can see from this graphic, usually the Confederate Army dressed in gray uniforms, and you can also see their Confederate flag right here. All right, let's move on to the Union Army. They also thought they had the upper hand in the war. They had a larger population. That means that they were able to field a larger army. They also had more resources. That means that they could have more food and more weapons for their soldiers. And they had more railroads, which made it easier to transport soldiers and transporting supplies. let's talk a little strategy for a minute. Let's talk about the Union strategy, which would be the Northern's plan for winning the Civil War. It was named the Anaconda Plan, and that plan was named after the anaconda snake. And that snake, it isn't poisonous. What it does is it wraps itself around its prey and it squeezes it. Now, you can see from this image that the plan was to wrap themselves around the southern states and eventually squeeze the life out of them. The designer of the plan was a Union general named Winfield Scott. And his first plan was that he was going to start down in the Gulf of Mexico and he was going to block southern ports so that trade and supplies would not be able to come in or out from other countries, hurting both their supplies for their army and hurting their economy. Second, they would decide to control the Mississippi River. So this river running right down here to those southern ports, they decided that if they would cut off the Confederacy in two, they would separate each other and it would also halt the movement of supplies and armies. And finally, the Union would then invade from the east and west once they successfully divided the two. And our last topic for today is the Confederate strategy, so the Southern strategies. They just did not want to lose. As long as the war was still going, they were still a country. As long as they were fighting the Civil War, the Confederate States of America lived on. So they wanted to play defense. They wanted to keep the war going. Another mission was that they wanted to break that blockade that we mentioned so that their ships could get through. They wanted to get help from Britain and France because they needed the South's cotton. So Britain and France both needed some of the exports coming out of the South. So they wanted to get assistance from them in defeating the Union. They wanted to invade and destroy Washington, D.C., a very symbolic gesture, similar to what the British did to us in the War of 1812. Now, a couple of interesting statistics. The Confederates, they had 1/10 of the supplies and 1/3 of the soldiers compared to the Union. So, in other words, if you think that the Confederates had 1 cannon, the Union Army would have 10 cannons. If you think that the Confederate Army would have 1 soldier, well, the Union had 3 soldiers to every one of their soldiers. So their strategy was to simply keep fighting until the United States gave up. Thank you for watching today, and we'll see you next time.